So, we have finally reached chapter 6 in the book of Esther, and this is a book that we've been working on, I think, for the last couple of months. And I think, and I hope, by this time, you're finally, or you are, well acquainted with the character of Haman, because he is the main villain in this story. Now, if you were to describe Haman, you would probably describe him as somebody who follows after the legacy of his own people. Haman, very early in this book, is described as an Agagite, one who is a descendant of Amalek, a people remembered for not just their evil, but they were a proud people who were always in opposition to God. And this perfectly captures who Haman is in this book. Now, sometimes in our own lives, we really generally don't like stereotypes, right? So sometimes we would say that Canadians are too polite. Sometimes we would say that Chinese people are good at math. And sometimes those stereotypes don't help or are not helpful. But in the book of Esther, these kind of descriptions about people's backgrounds are not just meant as kind of like, you should just know his nationality, but they are insightful in the person of who we are addressing. And so, again, it shouldn't be surprising to us that this, as it's describing Haman as an Agagite, it is a description of the person that we're going to meet throughout this book. Now, Haman clearly is a very deeply prideful man, much like his people were. And we actually get a really clear glimpse of this in Esther chapter 5. We see this intimate interaction between himself and some of his close friends about the things that he cares about, things that matter to him, things that he is thinking about. And that's really where we kind of share our deepest longings, right? If you can't share them openly with other people, you can certainly share them with your wife, you can share them with your closest friends and confidants. And we actually get this kind of glimpse into Haman's actual life. And as Haman starts to talk about his life to his friends, the things that he values, you can clearly see a man who thinks a lot about his own wealth, his own prestige. He thinks that his household, the kind of the majesty and the prestige of his household, having many sons. And he speaks of his honors and titles that he has received, emphasizing that his position surpasses everyone else's. Haman is second in the kingdom of Persia. He is the second greatest person alive in this world. And as we begin to hear him talk about his life, it really reveals how much he is like the people who he descends from. One last thing he talks about, which really actually shows his heritage, is how he talks about Mordecai. Mordecai is a Jewish person who they've been under the rule of Persia. And Mordecai is one who refuses to bow to Haman. And Haman's response is not how we would normally deal with something like that. We would kind of overlook it. We would just kind of pass it by. Haman has this murderous intent towards Mordecai all throughout the book. And he says at the end of chapter 5, as he's talking, so it says that in chapter 5, he's talking to Mordecai, that he could give up all of his wealth, he could give up all of his prestige if Mordecai would be killed and that his people would be destroyed. Now, in this time in chapter 5, we see that Haman's pride has lifted him up into a position of great power, that everything seems to fuel his arrogance and his ability to threaten God's people. He uses cunning manipulation, human ways, and human gains to gain the king's support, to set a judgment day against the people of Israel. And at the end of chapter 5, he's about to take Mordecai's life. And you might ask here at the end of this chapter, where is God through all of these things that are happening? Why is he allowing Haman to be raised up? Why is he allowing Haman to do this evil, to plan a day where his people will be destroyed? You might be asking the question I asked when we had a sermon on Esther chapter 2, is God really there? Is he really in control? Because look how powerful Haman is. Look what he is able to do. Look who can actually stop this person. Imagine if the Prime Minister of Canada was after you specifically. What kind of ability would you be able to stop them from taking everything that you have? What could you do? But as you kind of look at how the author of Esther thinks through this question, he is not afraid of Haman. He knows that Haman will rise. He knows that Haman will come. He knows that Haman can pronounce great evil upon people. But the writer or the author of this book is trying to get us to see that God has never left. He has not forgotten what has happened. He has seen everything that is going on, and he is fully in control of what is happening in this book. And the main idea that the author wants us to take away today is this, that in God's sovereign timing, he reverses expectations by humbling the proud and honoring the lowly. Now, as we kind of move into chapter 6, we have this kind of stark change of scenery, right, or change of setting, where we go from Haman leaving his place to go find a place where he can now go and hang Mordecai. He wants to set up the gallows to be able to take Mordecai's life. And then the scene shifts from chapter 5 to chapter 6 to now we're talking about the king. And at this moment, while Haman is heading to prepare to take Mordecai's life, God is working to save it. And he does it firstly by disturbing the king's sleep at the beginning of chapter 6. In the Hebrew, it actually literally says that the sleep flew away from the king that night, as if he couldn't catch it. It completely left him. And many commentators throughout history have recognized that this was not just a random act where the king would lose sleep. In fact, nothing in Esther is meant to be random. But what we see in the beginning of chapter 6 is an act of God where the king is left awake. It is a God-given insomnia meant to move the king to do something. And not only is he keeping him from sleep, God is keeping Haman from distraction. I want you to imagine if you had all the money in the world and you just woke up one night, what your activities might be if you were that rich, right? You might go and be like, okay, I'm going to go play on my gaming system. I'm going to go and maybe raid the pantry and eat a bunch of food. I'm going to go and see some entertainment or have some entertainment before me. And if I'm that rich, I'm going to order entertainment and they would come to me and entertain me. Yet in this book, he doesn't do any of those things which would be seemingly more interesting than what he does. Instead, he goes to the book of deeds, a book of deeds which lists out the different things that people have done. That's what he goes to. And this is a divine event in which God is calling the king to, because as he's listening to the events, he's reminded, because he's forgotten, of Mordecai's deeds of saving him from the plot of assassination. And now he remembers, I need to reward Mordecai. Now imagine if you're Mordecai. In Persia, it was highly unusual that if you did such an amazing act of saving the king, that you would receive nothing. And that's exactly what happens to Mordecai in this book. He got nothing out of saving the king. Not that maybe he wanted anything, but it's highly unusual that he didn't receive anything in this book. And he might have felt, probably rightly, that the king completely forgot about him. And he did. But though the king forgets about Mordecai, God has not forgotten Mordecai or his people. All throughout this book, it might feel like God has forgotten the people or forgotten Mordecai. Maybe even God is disinterested in helping his people. But nothing is further from the truth in this book. Even if God is not mentioned in this book as someone who is acting, he is behind the scenes in the tapestry of the book, working and waiting for the right time to act. And I think that for people who are feeling this for the first time, or people have this experience, sometimes they often feel like, God isn't working, God isn't really helping me, God is not really there. This is sometimes the way that you and I think, right? I think that sometimes when things go wrong or there are bumps in the road, when things get really bad, if you lose a job or you have a situation at school that's far from expected, you feel like things are helplessly out of control. Probably an over-exaggeration of your life, but when one small thing happens, everything seems to have gone wrong. And you start to ask this question, God, why are you so far away? Why are you so distant? God, are you even there? Do you even care? Can you even do anything? But this book reminds us that we should not let our feelings dictate the truth, because this story reminds us that God is always in control. He's ever present, always aware, and always working, not only for his glory, but for our good. And in this book, we now begin to see how God acts to save Mordecai and his people. Now, while Haman here is beginning to prepare the gallows to kill Mordecai, and he's about to go to the king and ask for the king if he is allowed to make this execution before Mordecai. But while he's trying to ask the king about executing Mordecai, the king is now seeking Haman's advice about how to honor him instead. Now, Haman doesn't know this, right? Haman just assumes that, the king is coming to me asking to honor somebody, and who would the king want to honor if not me? Right? I'm the second most important. I have all this wealth. I've done all these great things for the king. King must now see me. He now maybe wants to celebrate me. And so he starts to tell the king of the way in which this celebration should look like. Now, what is the one thing that Haman can't have? Haman has all of this wealth. Haman has all of this prestige. But there's one thing that Haman can never attain, and that's the honor reserved for a king, because he himself could never be king. So Haman, believing that he's going to be rewarded, Haman imagines a celebration where this celebration should be, you celebrate him like you would a king. You're going to give him a crown. You're going to give him royal robes. You're going to put him on this royal horse that lifts him high above everybody else in the crowd. And that this person should be paraded to the entire city, and the king should proclaim how great and how honored he is by this person. This is what Haman tells the king about how he should honor this person the king wants to honor. Now, you could imagine the surprised look on Haman's face when the king says, you should do exactly what you said, but the person I want you to honor is Mordecai. I want you to imagine if you were setting yourself up as the person who's going to receive this reward. So imagine you're thinking you're going to get a party, right? Let's say you're planning a party, and you're thinking that this party is going to be about you. So you buy the best cake, you buy the best candles, right? You invite the best DJ, and all of a sudden somebody tells you, it's like, oh, this party is not for you. It's for your brother. How much this would turn your entire imagination around, and so much more so for Haman. This is Haman's mortal enemy, and he has just created for him the most prestigious way to honor Mordecai. But not just that, it foils Haman's own plan, because you can't ask the king to execute the person he's about to honor. This is a time of Haman's great humiliation, right? The humiliation of basically setting himself up. His pride is preparing himself to get bigger and bigger. This parade is going to get bigger and bigger. I'm going to be honored greater and greater. And this honor is not reserved for him, but it's an honor reserved for his greatest enemy, Mordecai. And not only did he create this party, Mordecai had to dress him. He had to put the crown on his head. He had to put the robes on his shoulders. He had to get him up on the horse. And the second part, which is probably the most humiliating part, he had to publicly proclaim that this is the man the king delighted to honor. All of the things that Haman wanted for himself, he had to give to somebody who was his mortal enemy. There's this scene is actually meant to be ironic for us. It's meant to seem like a great reversal, because that's what it is. We see this person who the story has been building up, almost like the Tower of Babel, right? Building up to a point where he's at the height of his pride, the height of his arrogance, and suddenly, after building up for so long, almost like when you stack cards together, it's knocked all the way down. It is God's great poetic justice, God's great reversal, where we see Haman the prideful become Haman the lowly. We actually see this very clearly in verse 12, where we see after he had done all these great and wonderful things for Mordecai, he goes back to his house mourning and with his head covered. Now, as we read these stories, the story about Haman, his great fall from his pride, his great fall from actually trying to murder Mordecai, there are two major things that we take away from this story that I hope that we take away with us today. The first is this, that this story reminds us that our God is in complete control. Esther is a book that is written where every detail, whether it's seemingly important or seemingly insignificant, are all part of God's plan working out itself. That nothing in this story is outside of God's control. And it reminds us of this great truth that we read this morning in Romans chapter 8, verse 28, that all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purposes. And here we are invited and reminded and asked to think through the question about, is this, Christians, how we see our life, about how God works in our lives today? That your life is not just a series of unrelated events, but your life has motive and purpose, and they're all designed for God, for your good and for his purposes. That if you are in a high position, you are there for a reason. If you are in a low position, you are there for a reason. If you're doing well, you are there for a reason. If you're not doing well, it is also for a reason. Now, before any of the students get up and start quitting classes, I just want to be very, very clear here that sometimes the reason is that we need to take life more seriously. So I don't want any parents coming back to me. It's like, you told my kid to quit school because he wasn't doing well, so clearly God was telling him to quit school. That's not what I'm saying at all. In fact, if that's what you're going through, maybe what God is telling you is you probably need to put more time in school. But I would say other times, and mostly other times, that God puts us in different situations to see something, to learn something, to do something, to be something. God is using these sometimes arbitrary events in our lives for our good and for his purposes in our lives. I saw this most clearly when I was at Ryerson. Now, this would have been almost 15 years ago. Okay, I'm getting old. Okay, so 15 years ago, my parents live all the way around like Warden and Steeles, and so coming down, we went to Ryerson. That's an hour-and-a-half bus ride. Now, I probably should have asked my parents somewhere down along the way to maybe live downtown, but I never got there. So I had to ride the bus quite often. And as you may know, riding in the TDC transit subway sometimes is almost like a ride of different random encounters, right? So sometimes random people talk to you, sometimes random things happen. You never know what you're gonna get when you're on the subway. And I often found some of these encounters, especially when people were trying to talk to me, really annoying because I'm just trying to focus and get to school. I don't really want to have a conversation. Now, there was a moment in my life where I changed my thinking about this, where I stopped seeing things on the subway as annoying encounters and started to ask myself, what if these are possibly divine encounters? Now, I need to be very careful here because I'm not saying that you shouldn't take care of yourself, or you shouldn't be careful, that because the TDC can be a rough place sometimes. But it did open up a lot of different conversations that I wasn't expecting. And so if I saw a Mormon or a Jehovah's Witness that came on board, I would approach them and have a conversation with them. If I saw someone who was trying to ask me questions, I would try to interact with them, have a conversation with them. If someone was having a spiritual conversation in my earshot, I would try to find a way to kind of wheel my way in to the conversation. And I can't remember how often I had really good and deep spiritual conversations because I changed the way that of the perspective of what was going on. I wonder for how many of us what might await us or might be able to do for the kingdom of God if we just took a different perspective on our lives, that we are no longer living in fear of the unknown, but we live by faith because God knows. And that he's doing these things not to harm us, but because something good is happening in and through these things for us. And if we have this perspective, would this not change the way of how we look at our Christian lives, how we look at our faith, and how we can go on and kind of interact with the life around us? So this is number one, the first thing that I think we were to take away from this interaction, this great reversal of Haman's life. I think the second thing is it tells you something about what God actually values and what God is going to do about the thing that he hates. In this chapter in Esther, we witness this great reversal that the proud are humbled and the humbled are honored. And God does this not only just to save his people, but really to show you what he values. Because what God values is different than what the world values. What God honors is different than what the world honors. Because many people in the world are exactly like Haman and his circle of friends and family. They're living for praise and wealth and status and pride, and their mindset was celebrated in ancient Persia, and it's still celebrated today, where life becomes centered on self, on ego, on personal prestige. And if you maybe take a look at like any kind of social media, you look on Instagram and you look at some of maybe the most liked posts of this year, I'm willing to bet that a great many of them is people showing their lives in this pristine way. Look how rich I am. Look how happy I am. Look how many people love me and care about me. Look how good I look. As a Christian, this should not be true of us. Because for us, God does not delight even in the smallest trace of pride. Because all throughout the scripture, he tells us this is something he hates. Pride makes God our enemy because it seeks supremacy. It seeks to elevate ourselves above God, to place ourselves at the center of our lives. Pride is also this idea of what I would call a gateway sin, because from it, many other sins come out of pride. You know, how many times have you been prideful and then you do a bunch of other things that you regret later on, that you start to yell at people, you start to like chip at people, you start to make snarky remarks, start to gossip. Pride has this effect that it is a sin that is not contained within itself. It is a sin that completely impacts other things in our lives. We see this in Haman's life, right? If you looked at what kind of sin Haman commits, it all comes from a wounded ego, a wounded pride. And God is determined to reverse this order. He will humble the proud and honor the humble. This is a constant theme that we see throughout the scripture. We see it in Jesus' life. Jesus, who is in front of these religious elite, the Pharisees. It's really interesting because as you kind of look at the Pharisees, they actually are more like Haman than they are like Jesus, because they are so proud of their status, their knowledge, their following of the law. They trusted their own righteousness. They sought recognition from one another, and they looked down on those who were not like them. And yet Jesus is the paragon, or the perfect image of what humility should look like. Jesus doesn't come to seek his own recognition. He's come to serve, not to be served. He didn't come to find equality, something to be grasped here, but he emptied himself to find service and purpose in the work that he was doing, that he would come and die a humiliating death on the cross for his people, so that any who believe in him would not perish, they would receive eternal life. And in the end, it's Jesus who is lifted up, and the Pharisees who will be humbled at the final judgment. So we see this in the life of Jesus, that he is a great representation of this great reversal, even in the book. But maybe one other way in which we see how this idea of God reversing the order is true is in your salvation and mine. Because isn't that what the heart of the gospel actually is? It's about this great reversal. That you and I are to humble ourselves before him, saying that we have no glory in our own, no salvation in ourselves, that we place all of our dependence upon him, that he is the lifeline that we cling on to for real and everlasting life, and apart from him we can't truly have life, and that if we depend on him, he will save us from our sin. But if we cling to our pride, refusing to depend on him, we will be like the Pharisees, and we will be humbled at final judgment. This chapter is a great reminder of a kingdom ideal, or God's kingdom ideal, that he reverses the expectations of the world, that those who are last will come first, and those who are first will come last. Now, there's one last purpose to God's work from this chapter, because not only does God work for the good of his people or demonstrate something about what he values, but his work witnesses something about what he's doing, about who he is, about what he's focused on. In the last two verses, we see again another intimate interaction between Haman and his circle, which is made up largely of his wife and of these other wise people who were his friends. And at this time, they actually realize there are all these coincidences that are happening, but they're not really coincidences, that they recognize that something supernatural is happening in their midst. Now, for the Persians, they actually operate in this kind of world, similar worldview to ours, that in their world, they actually also see no coincidences, that all of the working, but for them, the things that are happening are the workings of God or of God's or of fate. These are the things that shape human life, and they could see the writing on the wall. They could recognize that the unseen forces are working in the favor of Mordecai and the Jewish people. And they rightly, almost prophetically here, recognize that this would lead to Haman's downfall. Now, what is so interesting about this last section is how, as one commentator sees, that even non-Christians at this time could see God's work so easily in this book. That they didn't need a ton of examples. They saw it and they said, this is what's happening. It's very clear to them. And yet there's no indication that Israel, God's actual people, saw how God was working. Certainly through this book we can see that they desired for God to act and to work. They mourned and they fasted for God to do work. But they weren't paying attention with their eyes to see God's sovereign act, that God was clearly showing them that he was actually with them. Is this a description of you and me this morning of how we might see our life? Do we actually see God's work in our lives, or do we just see them as random, arbitrary, maybe a series of unfortunate events that are happening in it? You know, sometimes as Christians, we are also the most prone to this issue that we think that God is not working. I can't remember the amount of conversations I've had where people are telling me, I'm going through all this trouble and these problems in my life, and I don't see God who is at work, and I'm wondering if God is distant from me. And then they would tell me the story about what is happening in their life. So you tell me if you experience this as well. If you've been in the same situation where people are telling you about how their life, God seems to be absent from it, but as they tell you the story about how they think God is absent, all you hear is, I completely see how God is active in your life, even if you don't see it. As a pastor, as some people's closest friend, it bothers me to no end when people tell me these stories that God is absent from them. But when I hear it, I can clearly see God. No, it's like, no, God is right there. You're actually telling me how God is there. But it's not just my frustration. I've heard my friends be frustrated with me when I tell them that exact same story. Part of our issue sometimes is we only think that God is working when he does supernatural things. Right? Only when God raises people from the dead, or that he'll turn water into wine. Oh, now I know that God is there. We have a really hard time recognizing when God is doing wonderful, powerful things in his purpose within the mundane parts or the normal parts of life, as it's kind of what we see in the book of Esther. Because in the book of Esther, there's no big aha moment here. There's no big moment where God is doing a great miracle. We're seeing the normal inclinations of what's happening in life, but God is working in every part of it. And all it takes for people to do is to have a spiritual perception of what is happening in their life. Do you have this own perception in your own life? Do you see how God is now working? Are you convinced that now how God is working and that he is giving you hope and courage to live your life fully dependent on him? Or are we like the Israelites who claim that they want to see God act, but they don't see that God is already acting on their lives? And God really desires for us to know this. This is why the author of this book writes this book in this way, because he wants us to trust in God's sovereign work in our lives, because this truth is life-changing. It is a truth that completely changes the way that you see your life and what you're doing in it and the purpose that you see in all the different actions of your life. That they're not meaningless pursuits, but they are purpose-driven actions that God is leading us somewhere to think something, to learn something, to do something, to be something. And to believe in this truth is what will make us competent for this life and to live this life to the fullest. I gave this example in my last sermon in Esther chapter 3 about my children, and it seemed to resonate well with people about what the difference is about when we believe this truth versus not. And so I'm going to give this example again because I thought it's relevant again. So I told this story where I have two kids, Constance and Phineas. Constance is my older daughter. She's 5. Phineas is 2, but he pretends like he's 3. So Phineas, so basically they're both in swimming classes. They've been enrolled in there for about a year and a half. And you really can tell the difference of how they react in swimming or how they deal with the swimming classes depending on how they trust their teacher. So I'll give you an example. For Phineas, he is one who doesn't trust his instructors at all. And because he doesn't trust his teachers, he doesn't trust them in the water, and he trusts himself, he's made very little progress in learning how to swim. And until he trusts his instructor more fully, he can never move forward. If you guys have ever been in swimming class, you know that our tendency is to never lie straight in the water to float. That by default, we want to make this kind of weird triangle shape, right? And we sink to the bottom. Well, that's Phineas. Because it's artificial to him to try to make this flat shape because he thinks he's gonna sink. Now, Constance, on the other hand, has made significant progress. She is more fearless. She perseveres through challenges. She continues to grow in her swimming skills because she trusts her instructor, even when they ask her to do or something difficult or she feels like something is hard. She follows their guidance with confidence. And when I watch this illustration or this story unfold in my own life, it's an illustration of how trust affects the people of God. Because if you do not trust God or your instructor in how to swim, you're going to have a hard time swimming or going through all of life. But if you entrust God, the great teacher, we can be strong in the Lord. We can live with courage rather than fear. And in fact, I would say it's hard to imagine how we could live this life without believing God is in sovereign control. Because it is only knowing that God truly is God, that he can do all things, that nothing happens apart from him, that gives us true confidence to place more and more of our trust in him on a daily basis. So what is your vision like in this world? Do you perceive the deeper spiritual truths in your own life as a Christian? Because if you don't, living the Christian life will be very, very difficult. So I want to conclude today just as a reminder of what we saw in this chapter, that in his own timing, God humbles Haman and honored Mordecai. And this story reminds us that God has a time where he will bring the low, the prideful, he will bring low the prideful, and he will bring those who are lowly to honor. And as we reflect on what this means for our own lives, we think of Romans chapter 8:28, reminds us that God is always at work and that he works everything out for our good and for his purposes. And this should encourage us to look at our circumstances in our life, not as a random act of jumbled events, but as situations where, like Mordecai, we've been placed there providentially. This doesn't mean that we shouldn't seek to improve our circumstances, but it does remind us that God can and will use our situations, whether we are honored or whether we are lowly, for our good and for his good pleasure. I hope that as you go out this week, that you are reminded of God's sovereign hand and ongoing work in your life. Amen. I'm going to ask the worship team if they would come up and let's sing our response song together.